Welcome to Cursed TV, where shadows whisper and the night comes alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Turn off the lights, relax, and let the stories begin. Story 1. I never imagined myself working at a mortuary. It was the kind of place I had always been wary of, ever since I was a kid. The very idea of being surrounded by bodies, lying there motionless yet with an uncanny sense of presence, always sent a chill through me. But life has a funny way of pushing you into corners you never expected, and so, here I am, walking into my first night shift at Ashford Mortuary, a place as old and creaky as the town it belongs to. Ashford is the kind of town that time forgot, a small, windswept place on the outskirts of nowhere, where the streets empty out by dusk and the only sounds at night come from the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional lonely train whistle. The morgue itself sits at the edge of town, past rows of dilapidated houses and a cemetery that stretches out like a black sea under the moonlight. The building is old, built in the 1930s, with flaking gray paint, heavy oak doors, and a brass sign that reads, Ashford Mortuary, in letters that have long lost their shine. I got the job almost by accident. Fresh out of college, having studied forensic science with the vague idea that I'd end up in some bustling city lab, I found myself back in Ashford, taking care of my ailing mother. When she passed away, there wasn't much keeping me here, but neither was there a reason to leave. The town's only funeral home was looking for help, and the mortician, Mr. Everly, seemed grateful to have someone take the night shifts, which he himself was getting too old to handle. Mr. Everly was a kind but tired man, with a slight stoop and eyes that held too many memories. He showed me around on my first day, explaining how everything worked, how to handle the paperwork, the autopsy tools, the cold storage units. But he was clear about one thing: the night shift is different, he said with a lingering glance toward the dimly lit hallways. You'll be alone, but, well, just keep to your routine and don't wander off too far. I brushed off his words as the quirks of an old man. But as he handed me the keys to the building, there was a moment where his hand lingered on mine, a look in his eyes that I couldn't quite place, something between pity and caution. And then he left, with a quiet nod. The first hour of my shift was quiet. I filled out paperwork, familiarized myself with the procedures, and listened to the hum of the cooling units. It felt like a peaceful place, oddly calming, considering the nature of the work. It was around midnight when I first heard it, the quiet creak of the main door, followed by slow, shuffling footsteps coming down the hallway. I turned around, expecting to see one of the medical examiners who occasionally came by to finish reports. Instead, an elderly man stood at the entrance of the autopsy room. He wore a gray suit that had seen better days, the kind that looked like it came straight out of an old photograph. His hair was a thin, silvery white, slicked back in a style that had long since gone out of fashion. Despite his age, his posture was ramrod straight, hands clasped behind his back as he peered into the room. You must be the new assistant, he said, his voice carrying a faint rasp, like the sound of dry leaves underfoot. Name's Samuel. I nodded, trying to hide my surprise. I'm Alex. I didn't think anyone else would be around at this hour. He gave me a tight-lipped smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. I've been around these halls longer than you'd think. Figured I'd give you some pointers. Night shifts can get tricky. I shrugged off the strangeness of it all. Maybe he was just another old-timer who'd worked here back in the day, unable to let go. He offered me advice on handling the bodies, speaking in vague, roundabout ways, but one thing he said stuck with me. You'll want to lock that third storage unit 3 times, every time. Trust me on that, lad. Keeps things where they ought to be. His eyes, pale and unblinking, seemed to linger on the cold storage unit as if it held some unspoken history. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but something about his tone made me pause. All right, I'll keep that in mind, I said, humoring him. He nodded, satisfied, and shuffled back into the shadows of the hallway, his footsteps fading like a sigh in the dark. Several minutes later, I found myself standing in front of that very cold storage unit. Number 3. I remembered Samuel's words, and with a shrug, I decided to follow his advice. One turn of the key, then another, then a third. The lock clicked each time, sounding unusually loud in the silence. And that's when I heard it. It started as a faint scratching, like nails dragging across metal. I pressed my ear against the door, thinking it might be the cooling mechanism acting up, but the sound grew louder, turning into muffled whispers, then moans that vibrated through the metal. My chest tightened with a sense of unease. I took a step back, but then I saw fingers, pressing against the frosted glass from inside, their outlines distorted but unmistakably human. They clawed at the door, leaving smudged streaks across the glass. I froze. The sound swelled to a frantic banging, like someone was desperate to get out. I fumbled for the key, my mind racing with possibilities, rational explanations that suddenly seemed hollow in the face of those frantic fingers. But just as I was about to unlock the door, I remembered Samuel's warning and stepped back. The banging stopped. Silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. I waited for a few seconds, then forced myself to look through the glass again. The fingers were gone, leaving only a faint fog on the window. When I finally mustered the courage to unlock the door and open it, the body inside lay in its original position, lifeless, still, but its head turned to face me, eyes wide open. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, but before I could process what I was seeing, Samuel reappeared, his face twisted into an expression that I could almost describe as proud. "You did well," he said softly. "You kept it under control. You followed my advice." I wanted to question him, to demand an explanation, but the words lodged in my throat like shards of ice. Samuel patted my shoulder in an almost fatherly gesture, then turned and vanished into the dim hallway, leaving me alone with the corpse. My hands were shaking as I closed the unit again, triple-checking the lock before stepping away. Later, when the adrenaline had worn off, I decided to check the security footage. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, on the grainy screen, I watched myself standing motionless in front of the storage unit for over an hour, my face blank and expressionless. And Samuel? He was nowhere to be seen. I tried to shake off the unease as I finished my shift, but the memory of that footage lingered in my mind like a stain that wouldn't wash out. It didn't make sense. How could I have stood there for an hour when I could have sworn it was only a few minutes? And what about the old man? He had been right there, but the camera showed nothing, just me, frozen, staring into that damn storage unit like I was in a trance. As the first rays of dawn crept through the high, narrow windows of the morgue, I left the building, my thoughts in turmoil. Mr. Everly was just parking his car, but I didn't stick around to chat. I just waved at him and said, "I'm out, need to get home." "Rough night," he replied. "Yeah, something like that." The following evening, I tried to convince myself it had all been my imagination, some trick of the mind caused by fatigue. But deep down, I knew there was something more to this place, something far more unsettling than the quiet loneliness of working with the dead. And worst of all, I had the creeping sensation that Samuel would be back. When I returned for my next shift that night, the air felt heavier. I did my rounds as usual, checking the cold storage units and autopsy room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed a little too deep, every creak of the old pipes a whisper I couldn't quite catch. By midnight, I found myself in the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to clear the cobwebs from my mind. As I reached for the paper towels, I glanced up at the mirror, and that's when my heart lurched into my throat. My reflection wasn't there. The sink, the tiles, the dull light overhead, everything else was mirrored perfectly. But where I should have been standing, there was only empty space. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, thinking it had to be a trick of my mind. But when I looked again, I saw him, Samuel, standing in the doorway behind me, his mouth moving silently as if he was speaking. I spun around, but the doorway was empty, the door half open, swinging gently on its hinges. When I turned back to the mirror, it remained dark, blank. A chill crawled down my spine, like icy fingers trailing along my skin. For a moment, I thought I saw other faces in the glass, pale, expressionless, their eyes hollow and staring. Then the lights flickered, and in that brief flash, they vanished. I staggered back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and reached for the door. But as soon as my fingers touched the handle, it slammed shut with a force that sent a shudder through the walls. I yanked on it, but it wouldn't budge, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my hands began to sweat as I pounded on the door, shouting for help that I knew wouldn't come. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing stale and cold. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. I stumbled out, gasping for breath, and in the dim hallway light, I saw scratches on the inside of the door, deep grooves etched into the wood, as if someone had clawed desperately to get out. Samuel's voice, low and calm, drifted through the darkness behind me. They don't like it when you look too closely at your own face here. It confuses them. I turned to face him, my anger barely masking the fear bubbling up inside me. What the hell is going on here, Samuel? What are they? He only offered me that same cryptic smile, a flicker of regret passing over his lined features. You'll understand, eventually. But for now, you've got to keep your head down. You're still new. They're curious about you. He walked away before I could ask more, disappearing into the shadows once again, leaving me with more questions than answers. I glanced back at the bathroom door, the scratches glinting in the pale light, and a thought struck me that sent a shiver through my bones. Whoever had tried to get out of that room wasn't me. The next hour passed in a haze of unease. I moved from task to task mechanically, avoiding my own reflection wherever I could, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me. Around 1 a.m, I was in the embalming room, preparing the body of an elderly man for storage. It was a simple, repetitive task that didn't require much focus, but tonight, I couldn't stop glancing at the walls. There was a subtle, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, that seemed to come from every direction at once. At first, I thought it was my own breath, ragged and uneven from nerves. But then I noticed the walls. They seemed to expand and contract, like the lungs of some unseen creature. I froze, my breath catching as the slow, labored breathing grew louder, filling the room with a chill that settled deep in my bones. I pressed my back against the metal slab, watching as the walls pulsed, as if trying to draw in air. Suddenly, Samuel appeared in the doorway, watching me with an expression that might have been pity. "They're remembering what it felt like to breathe," he murmured. His voice had a hollow echo, as if coming from some distant place. "It's been so long since they felt anything." I tried to edge toward the door, but when I reached for the handle, it refused to budge. The walls seemed to swell around me, the breathing filling my ears until it drowned out my own thoughts. Panic flared in my chest, but Samuel stepped closer, resting a cold, bony hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, almost painfully so, and he whispered, "Breathe with them. They can't leave until they know you feel it too." Desperation clawed at me, but I had no choice. I forced myself to match the rhythm of the walls, inhaling deeply, then exhaling as the room seemed to press in around me. Each breath felt like it was being dragged from my lungs, and as the minutes crawled by, a heavy mist gathered in the corners of the room, thickening the air. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door swung open with a slow, agonizing creak. The breathing faded, leaving me alone in the cold, mist-filled room, my limbs trembling and my skin clammy with sweat. I turned to thank Samuel, but he was gone, leaving me with only the faint echo of his last words in the still air. After the encounter in the embalming room, the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. The air was thick with a sense of dread, and every small sound, drips of water from a leaky pipe, the groaning of old wood, made my skin prickle. The breathing walls had left me rattled, but I couldn't afford to dwell on it. There were still bodies to move, tasks to finish, and I had to keep going if I wanted to make it through the shift. Around 2 in the morning, I went to the autopsy room to prepare another body for cold storage. The room was lit by a single overhead light, casting long shadows that seemed to flicker in the corners of my vision. I was halfway through lifting the body onto a gurney when I heard a faint, high-pitched sound that cut through the silence like a knife. I froze, straining my ears, trying to place the noise. It was soft, almost like the wind at first, but it grew clearer with every passing second until I recognized it for what it was. Crying. The sound of a child crying. It echoed through the hallway, distant but unmistakable. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I set the gurney down, my hands trembling, and moved toward the door, peering into the dark corridor beyond. The sound continued, growing louder, more desperate. It was coming from somewhere down the hall, toward the cold storage units. I told myself it couldn't be real. But as I walked down the hallway, the crying grew clearer, turning into heart-wrenching sobs that twisted my insides. I reached the cold room, where the sound seemed strongest, and stepped inside. A body lay on the slab. But its face had changed. Tears streamed down its sunken cheeks, pooling on the metal table beneath it, and its eyes, those wide, lifeless eyes, were now open, staring straight at me. The crying came from its mouth, though it never moved, the sound pouring out in a thin, reedy wail that filled the room. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs, my mind struggling to make sense of the impossible sight before me. That's when Samuel appeared again, stepping out from behind a shadowy corner as if he'd been waiting there the whole time. "They don't all go quietly," he said, his voice low and even, as though he were discussing the weather. "Some of them hold on too tight. They forget what they are." I looked at him, trying to force the words out through my fear. What do I do?" Samuel's expression softened slightly, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out 2 tarnished silver coins. He walked over to the body with a calm, deliberate pace and placed the coins over its eyes, murmuring something under his breath, words that sounded like a prayer, but in a language I didn't recognize. The moment the coins touched the corpse, the crying stopped. Its eyes slid shut, and its face went slack, returning to the stillness of death. He turned to me, his hand still resting gently on the body's forehead. "You'll need to learn this. It's not enough to be strong, lad. You've got to know the old ways. Keep the dead where they belong, or they'll start taking more than just your time." "What do you mean, taking more?" I asked, but Samuel only shook his head, slipping the coins back into his pocket as he walked past me. He paused at the doorway, glancing back over his shoulder, a shadow crossing his face. "Perform it wrong, and they might take more than just coins from you," he said softly. His words hung in the air long after he disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with the body and the quiet drip of water in the distance. I didn't see Samuel for a while after that, but his warnings clung to my thoughts like a stain I couldn't wash out. I started carrying a few spare coins in my pocket, though I had no idea if they would help. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little less powerless. I moved through my duties on autopilot, my senses heightened to every shadow, every shift in the air. The building seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if something hidden in the walls was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. Sometime after 3 in the morning, the air grew unnaturally still, as if the entire building had fallen into a hushed silence. I was walking through the hallway outside the autopsy room when I heard footsteps. At first, they were faint, like the soft padding of bare feet against tile. But they grew louder, echoing through the empty corridors, following me wherever I went. I spun around, expecting to see Samuel playing a cruel joke. But the hallway was empty, shadows pooling in the corners like thick ink. The footsteps continued, steady, relentless, matching my own as I walked faster, then broke into a run. It was as if someone was pacing just behind me, always a few steps out of sight. Panic surged through me, but as I ran, Samuel showed up, standing inches away from me, his pale eyes unblinking. I nearly collided with him, stopping myself just in time, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. He placed a finger to his lips, the gesture slow and deliberate. "They like to pretend they're still alive," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "But you must not turn around, no matter how close they get. Acknowledge them, and they'll become too real." My mouth was dry, my tongue heavy as I tried to form a question, but before I could speak, Samuel stepped back, vanishing into the shadows once more. The footsteps, now just behind me, grew faster, their rhythm erratic, filled with an urgent energy that sent shivers down my spine. Cold breath brushed the back of my neck, and I could feel the weight of a presence pressing in, closer and closer. I forced myself to keep walking, fighting the urge to turn and face whatever was behind me. My heart pounded in my ears, my legs moving mechanically, each step an act of defiance against the growing fear. The footsteps seemed to surround me, closing in from every direction, but I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look back. Eventually, the footsteps began to fade, retreating into the distance until the only sound left was my own ragged breathing. I sagged against the wall, the tension draining from my body in a wave of exhaustion. I stayed there for a while, trying to catch my breath, until the building's silence settled around me like a shroud. The rest of the night dragged on with an oppressive weight, the minutes crawling by like hours. My mind kept replaying the strange encounters with Samuel, the chilling footsteps, the crying corpse, each event weaving itself deeper into the fabric of my thoughts. By now, I had given up on finding rational explanations. Whatever was happening in this place was beyond logic, beyond the natural. Yet, something inside me knew that I had to make it through the night. Dawn was my only hope, a promise of light that might chase away the shadows lurking in the morgue. It was nearing 4 a.m. when I heard the chime of a bell from the reception area, the faint, metallic ding that sent a shiver through my already frayed nerves. The morgue was locked, yet, the sound echoed through the empty hallways, clear and insistent. I approached the waiting room cautiously, each step hesitant. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the worn, threadbare chairs. There, in the far corner of the waiting room, sat an elderly woman with her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Her clothes were outdated, like she'd stepped out of a different time, the fabric faded and worn. She didn't react as I entered, sitting stiffly with her hands folded in her lap. I cleared my throat, trying to mask the unease that clawed at my gut. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but this place is closed. How did you get in?" My voice wavered slightly, the question sounding more like a plea. She lifted her head, revealing a pale, gaunt face lined with deep wrinkles. Her eyes, though shadowed by the brim of her hat, seemed empty, like wells that led into darkness. When she spoke, her voice was soft and brittle, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "I'm here for my son. He was supposed to be processed tonight." Her words lingered in the air, each syllable carrying a strange weight that made my skin crawl. I swallowed hard, trying to maintain my composure. I'm not sure what you mean. There's no record of any new arrivals tonight." She shook her head slowly, a tremor running through her frail form. No, you're mistaken. My son is here. I must see him before I go. Please." Her voice cracked on the last word, a note of desperation creeping into her tone that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I glanced down at the logbook on the reception counter, flipping through the entries, my hands unsteady. But there was no record of anyone matching her description, or anyone scheduled for processing that night. As I turned the pages, a chill ran through me. My own name stared back at me, written neatly in the margins with tonight's date and time, as if I had been catalogued alongside the deceased. I looked up quickly, but the old woman was gone. In her place stood Samuel, his face drawn with an expression I could only describe as regret. "She comes when a new one is about to join us," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of sorrow. "You'll see her again when it's time." I stepped back, my pulse racing, trying to make sense of his words. "What do you mean, a new one?" I'm not. The words died in my throat, replaced by a sudden, awful realization. She thought I was. Samuel's gaze met mine, his eyes filled with a sadness that cut deeper than any of his cryptic warnings. You've been marked, lad. You wouldn't be here otherwise. This place, it calls to those who have one foot on either side. It's no accident you took this job. A wave of nausea rolled through me, and I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. My mind reeled with the implications, but before I could question him further, he turned away, fading into the shadows of the hallway, leaving me alone with the chill that seeped through the room. The events of the night had left me shaken to my core. I stood there, staring at my reflection in a small, dusty mirror. My face looked haggard, older somehow, as if I'd aged years in a single day. I tried to imagine what the rest of my life would look like if I stayed here, staring into shadows, listening to the whispers of the dead. But just as the thought crossed my mind, I heard a soft sigh, like the exhalation of breath behind me. I turned slowly, expecting to see Samuel again. But there was nothing, only the dark, empty hallway stretching out behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew with a sudden, bone-deep certainty that my time was running out. Just a few minutes later, I found myself standing once more in front of cold storage unit number 3. The metal door gleamed in the dim light, its frost-rimmed window obscured by a thin layer of condensation. I reached for the key, my fingers numb and shaking. I turned the lock once, twice, and then a third time, the clicks echoing through the silence. But as I pulled my hand away, I heard a faint murmur, a low voice that seemed to come from within the locker, whispering my name. Alex. My breath hitched. The voice was familiar, but distorted, like a memory being dragged through water. Against my better judgment, I leaned closer to the glass, peering into the dark recesses of the storage unit. For a moment, I thought I saw my own reflection staring back at me, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes, but then it moved, lips curling into a smile that wasn't mine. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. Before I could catch my breath, Samuel appeared beside me, his presence as sudden and unnerving as ever. He looked at me with an intensity that I hadn't seen before, his expression grim and unyielding. You're running out of time, he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The building, the dead, they're all waking up to you, lad. If you don't accept it, you'll never leave this place. Not truly. I shook my head, backing away from him, trying to put distance between us. I never asked for this. I just wanted a job, a way to move on. Samuel's face softened, but there was no pity in his eyes, only a weary resignation. The dead need a guide, and the living don't come here unless they're already halfway gone. You were chosen, same as I was. No, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I'm not like you. He stepped closer, his silhouette looming against the dull glow of the hallway lights. You'll have to face them, then. All of them. His words settled into my mind like a poison. He reached out a hand, as if to offer some final comfort, but I recoiled, the anger bubbling up inside me. I turned away from him, my thoughts racing. If he was right, if I truly couldn't leave until I confronted whatever spirits haunted this place, then I'd do it. But not on his terms. Not as another ghost waiting in the shadows. The next few minutes passed in a blur of frantic preparation. I gathered the silver coins Samuel had shown me, lining my pockets with them. I carried the logbook with my name scrawled inside it, hoping that it might hold some clue to undoing whatever bond had been placed on me. The plan was simple, desperate. I'd confront whatever lingered in the morgue's shadows, whatever spirits or echoes of the past haunted the halls. I'd make them see me, understand that I didn't belong here. The footsteps returned, this time louder, faster, as if something was pacing around me, circling closer with every second. I felt a cold hand brush the back of my neck, and I forced myself to keep walking, my back to the unseen presence, knowing that if I turned around, it would be over. You don't belong here. I shouted into the darkness, my voice cracking with desperation. "You're dead. All of you are dead." A woman's face appeared in the shadows, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. She reached for me with claw-like fingers, but I tossed a coin into the darkness between us. Her figure wavered, then dissolved into a mist that dissipated into the air, leaving behind a bitter, acrid smell. More of them came, faces twisted with rage or sorrow, hands reaching from the dark corners of the morgue, their whispers like a tidal wave in my ears. With every passing moment, I felt myself growing weaker, as if the building itself was draining the life from my veins. I stumbled into the waiting room, the final silver coin clutched in my hand, my vision blurring with exhaustion. And there she was again, the old woman in the wide-brimmed hat, sitting calmly in her chair as if she had been waiting for me all along. Her eyes glinted in the half-light, and when she spoke, her voice was like the crackle of dried leaves. "You've done well, child. But you can't cheat the shadows forever." Her words cut through me, and I fell to my knees, the last of my strength slipping away. I reached for the ledger in my pocket, but it felt like dead weight, dragging me down into the darkness. She stood and stepped closer, her features sharpening into a mask of sorrow and pity. "Do you see now?" she whispered, bending down until her face was inches from mine. "You were always meant to stay." The woman reached out and gently touched my cheek, her hand cold as winter's breath. I clutched the silver coin and pressed it against her hand. She recoiled with a hiss, her face twisting into a mask of rage, and for a moment, I thought she would tear me apart. But then, her figure began to fade, unraveling into threads of shadow that dissolved into the air. Her whispers lingered, slipping away into the dark, leaving me kneeling on the cold, tiled floor, my heart pounding in the silence. I don't remember how long I stayed there, slumped against the reception counter. But as I rose to my feet, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass doors. My face looked older, lined with exhaustion and something deeper, a weariness that mirrored the look I had seen in Samuel's eyes. It was around 5 in the morning, when I decided to search the archives in the basement, old records, paperwork, anything that might shed light on how this strange cycle had begun. The basement was a labyrinth of narrow shelves, stacked with yellowed files and dusty ledgers, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. As I sorted through the piles, a sense of urgency pressed against my chest, as if time was slipping away faster than I could grasp. I found a box marked Ashford History, and opened it, my fingers brushing against brittle newspaper clippings and photographs that crumbled at the edges. One photo caught my eye, a black and white image of the morgue from decades ago. There, in front of the building, stood a younger Samuel, his face stern and expressionless as he posed beside a group of somber-looking men. But the most unnerving detail was the figure standing in the doorway behind them, its features blurred, but somehow familiar. The longer I stared at the photograph, the more I realized that the figure in the background bore a striking resemblance to me. My hands shook as I set the photo down, my breath quickening in the confined space. It didn't make sense, none of this did, but the implications churned in my mind like a sickness. Was I just another link in a chain that had been repeating itself for generations? And if so, was there ever truly a way out? As I rifled through more documents, I came across a journal, its leather cover cracked and stained. The words scrawled and hurried, desperate lines that seemed to grow more frenzied with each page. They see me. They follow me in the dark. I can hear them whispering my name. I am becoming part of this place, as they did before me. But there must be a way to sever the ties, to give them peace without binding myself to their fate. Perhaps if I face them, confront what lies beyond the veil, but the price may be too great. The final entry was smudged, the ink smeared as if by a trembling hand. If you are reading this, then you are the next. Know that you have a choice, but choices are never without cost. Find the ledger, and you will find your answer. I stared at the words, a sense of grim determination settling over me. I made my way back to the cold storage, clutching the journal in one hand, the silver coin in the other. The building felt more alive than ever, the air thick with whispers that brushed against my skin like cold breath. The shadows seemed to shift around me, moving with a will of their own, guiding me toward the third unit, where the ledger lay open on the counter. As I approached, the temperature dropped sharply, frost creeping across the glass of the storage doors. The whispers swelled, growing louder until they formed words that clawed at the edges of my mind. "Stay with us. You belong here. Join us." I ignored the voices, focusing on the ledger, flipping through its pages until I found the entry with my name. The ink glistened as if freshly written, and beside it, I saw a small, empty space, just large enough for a signature. Samuel's words came back to me. "You have a choice, but choices are never without cost." My hand hovered over the ledger, the pen trembling between my fingers. I could sign it, accept my place, become its caretaker like Samuel before me. Or I could do what he had been too afraid to do. Confront the restless spirits, force them to move on, and risk whatever consequences came with it. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the fear that gnawed at my insides, and turned away from the ledger. "I'm not signing it," I said, my voice echoing through the empty halls. For a moment, there was only silence, a stillness so profound that it seemed as if time itself had paused. But then, the building shuddered, a low, rumbling groan that vibrated through the floors, the walls, the very air. The shadows coalesced, taking shape in the darkness, forming faces, twisted, mournful, filled with a yearning that clawed at my mind. They surged toward me, hands reaching out, eyes wide with an emptiness that threatened to swallow me whole. I forced myself to meet their gaze, to hold on to the last shreds of defiance that kept me anchored to reality. And then I spoke the words from the journal, the incantation that bound the dead, but with a twist, changing the final line to one of release instead of containment. "Be at peace," I whispered, my voice breaking, my breath turning to mist in the frigid air. "This place is not for you anymore. Go beyond, leave me behind." The words felt strange on my tongue, almost as if they didn't belong to me. The groaning of the building deepened, turning into a rumble that shook the walls, sending dust raining down from the rafters. The faces began to blur, their outlines fraying and distorting, until they were no more than dark shapes caught in a current I couldn't see. The shadows dissolved, retreating into the corners of the room, fading into the cracks between the walls until all that was left was silence, a silence so deep it felt like the entire world had paused. I opened my eyes, my vision blurred with tears I hadn't realized I'd shed, and looked around. I stumbled forward, leaning heavily on the counter as I caught my breath, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. My fingers brushed against the ledger, and I looked down at the page where my name was written. The ink had faded, the letters smudged as if washed away by some unseen hand. I stared at it, a wave of relief washing over me. I had done it. I had broken the cycle. The spirits had moved on, finally released from whatever held them here. I spent the next few minutes walking the halls, searching for any lingering signs of the entities that had once haunted the morgue. But the building felt different now, emptier, quieter, like a long-neglected house finally rid of its ghosts. When the first light of dawn spilled through the windows, casting golden beams across the tiled floors, I felt a flicker of hope in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. As I gathered my things to leave, I found myself drawn back to the waiting room, where the morning sun had chased away the shadows. I stood in front of the glass door, the same one that had shown me only darkness, and forced myself to look at my reflection. It was me, older, more worn, but undeniably me. The lines of exhaustion were still etched into my face, but there was a clarity in my eyes that I hadn't seen before. I raised a hand to my cheek, half expecting to see something else staring back, but the glass only reflected the movement, as it should. I turned to leave, but as I took a step closer to the front door, I hesitated, glancing back over my shoulder one last time. The silence of the building seemed to press in around me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the farthest corner of the hallway, his silhouette outlined in the morning light. Samuel. He stood there, watching me with a faint smile on his lips, a look of something that might have been approval in his pale eyes. He raised a hand in a gesture that seemed almost like a farewell, and I blinked, expecting him to fade back into the shadows. But instead, he simply disappeared, dissolving into a slant of light that cut across the hallway. A shiver ran through me, but I forced myself to turn away, to focus on the door in front of me. I pushed against it, the hinges creaking as it swung open. Fresh air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and wet earth, the world beyond the morgue alive and vibrant with the morning. I stepped outside, blinking against the sudden brightness, and felt the sun warm my face. The trees that surrounded the building swayed gently in the wind, their leaves whispering a soft, soothing song that seemed to echo the peace I had found inside. I walked to my car, my legs unsteady but my mind clearer than it had been in days. As I got into the driver's seat and turned the ignition, I allowed myself a final glance at the old brick building, its shadow long and dark against the morning light. Part of me wondered if I would ever return, if the pull of that place would draw me back, now that I knew its secrets. But for now, I knew that I had earned my freedom, however temporary it might be. I drove away from Ashford Mortuary, the road winding through the trees, carrying me away from the shadows that had nearly swallowed me whole. And though I knew that the scars of that place would linger inside me, I also knew that I had faced the darkness and survived. As I rounded the bend, the morgue disappeared from my rearview mirror, swallowed by the forest. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to move on. The quiet lingered in my thoughts, a reminder of the things that had been left unsaid, the faces that still haunted my dreams. I thought of Samuel, his eyes filled with that strange, sad wisdom, and wondered if he had found peace in the end, or if he still lingered somewhere between the walls, watching over the place he had once called home. And as I drove into the rising sun, a single thought whispered through my mind, like a breath, like a shadow, like the faintest echo of a voice. Your shift is over when you've made peace with it. Story 2. For the past 2 years, I've been working as a mortician at a funeral home in a small town. I actually love it here. I listen to lots of audiobooks, my boss is great, and I don't mind the company of the dead. They're quiet and they're not trying to sell me something, which is a lot more than I can say for most of the living. I also feel like preparing the bodies for burial is an act of respect, a service to the community, something that gives my life meaning. Without a doubt, working here was the best job I'd ever had. Until we started getting the smiling corpses. I don't know when it started, exactly. 3 weeks ago, I think, although time has been passing strangely since it all began. When it started, of course, not all the bodies were smiling. It was just 1 or 2. Then we started getting more and more of them, and everything began to spiral out of control. To be clear, yes, I know that sometimes the deceased appear to be smiling slightly. Sometimes their facial features are built that way, sort of a resting happy face. Sometimes we even turn their lips up a little, to make their faces seem more familiar, more alive, instead of the cold mask of death. But these bodies weren't smiling slightly. No, they were full-on grins, stretching dead skin to the corners of their mouths. They were grotesque. The first one came on a cold, rainy day. Her name was Amber, and she was 31 years old. Much younger than the bodies I usually worked with. She died of a sudden blood clot. As much as I liked my job, I hated dealing with the younger ones. Before I even unzipped the body bag, I was imagining the small children she may have left behind. The aging parents, grieving their daughter. The friends and family mourning a life gone too soon. I extinguished the thoughts and got to work. I turned on the light, rolled the steel bed a little closer to me, and reached for the body bag zipper. But when I unzipped her, I froze. She was smiling. Her lips were pressed tightly together, covering her teeth, and the corners of her mouth sharply curved upwards. An expression like that wouldn't just require you to move your facial muscles, it would require you to hold them like that. I quickly unzipped the rest of the bag. But she was definitely dead. Her skin was as white as marble. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were blue. What the fuck? Maybe she was somehow alive. Hands shaking, I gently touched her lips, then her cheeks. Her skin was so cold. I reached into the body bag and pulled out her bony wrist, checking for a pulse. There wasn't any. Now, if I weren't a mortician, I'd be thinking, no big deal, she died smiling, and rigor mortis set in. But I knew that was impossible. Rigor mortis takes hours. If she died smiling, her face would naturally relax into a neutral setting before everything went stiff. I stood there, my head spinning. There was no way she was alive. But there was no way she could be grinning like this, dead. Not knowing what else to do, I called my boss in. He looked just as confused as I was. Maybe, she had some sort of deformity, he said. And this is her natural expression. I don't think so. The next theory was that the coroner was doing it, before the bodies got to us. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe he thought he was helping us, making the bodies look a little less dead. He was a bit odd, so it wasn't out of the question. But even if he made them smile, the smile would fade before they got here, I pointed out. That kind of smile, with her lips covering her teeth like that, requires the muscles to stay flexed. Alan didn't know what to say to that, so he excused himself to call the coroner. When he came back, his expression was grim. Jack said she wasn't smiling, when he was doing the autopsy. Dread flooded me, like someone had just dumped a bucket of ice water over me. So the smile had happened, after she died? On the drive over from the coroner? That's impossible, I said, my voice wavering. I know. Who else had access to the body? He shook his head. No one should have had access to the body, except us, the coroner, and the drivers who delivered her. Well, fuck. We made a few more calls, to police officers, medical examiners, even a few EMTs, but no one knew what we were talking about. And the body had been securely locked away after the autopsy, according to the coroner. It looked like no one had tampered with the body. So, maybe it was just something about Amber. Something congenital, some sort of disease or something. That her mouth turned up in a smile several hours after death. I knew it made no sense, but what else was I supposed to tell myself? That some demon had possessed her dead body and made it smile? That a ghost was holding up the corners of her mouth? Nothing made sense. What should I do with her? I asked Alan. Set her features like normal, I guess, he replied. Call me back if there's anything else, weird. Then he turned on his heel and walked away. So that's what I did. After pacing the room a few times to calm myself down, I walked back over to the body. I positioned my index and middle fingers over the corners of her mouth, and in one swift motion, pushed down. Something felt different. I poked and prodded her cheeks, frowning. Usually cheeks are soft, with the cheekbones and jaw bones giving them structure. But her cheeks felt firm all over. Like they had their own internal structure, somehow. Maybe she had work done, like fillers or Botox. I thought. I poked and prodded some more, but that only confused me further. Something just felt off about the way her bones and facial muscles were all fitting together, just underneath the skin. I called Alan back over. Does her face feel weird to you? He poked and prodded at her face as well, frowning. A little bit, he said, finally. But not abnormally. Could be plastic surgery. That's what I thought. Hey, maybe that's why she's smiling. I mean, it's possible, I guess, he replied. Then he left, and I was back to setting her features all alone in the morgue. My fingers worked over her cold skin quickly, trying to get the whole thing over with as fast as possible. But the more I worked, the more time I spent with her alone in this room, the more panicked I became. Suddenly, I felt dizzy. I couldn't breathe, couldn't get enough oxygen. My legs felt weak underneath me. I was on the verge of a panic attack. I stepped away from the body. Forced myself to take a deep breath. Name 5 things you can see, I told myself. Cabinets, hand sanitizer, scissors, linens, and Amber's dead body. This grounding technique wasn't quite as effective when I was in the morgue room. I'd never had a panic attack here before. The bodies had never bothered me like this. I was always able to dissociate it from the person who lived in it. I was always able to convince myself it was just dead flesh, just something left behind, no different than the strands of hair and dead skin we leave behind when we're alive. But this time was different. The grotesque grin. Pushing my fingers hard into her flesh, forcing her mouth to turn down. Something deep inside me snapped. I took a few more minutes to collect myself, taking in deep, calming breaths. Then I forced myself to continue working. I walked over to the cabinet, got out the clear thread, and started to sew her mouth shut. You had to, otherwise, their mouth would loll open and look weird. I'd forgotten to do it once, and it was the only time Alan yelled at me. But as I worked on the stitches, I couldn't stop picturing Amber's grin. And I felt like there was more resistance from her lips than there should have been, or was I imagining it? The needle slipped against my fingers, but I forced myself to keep going, even though my heartbeat was ratcheting up again. I ran a comb through her dyed blonde hair, arranging it with my hands. I swirled a brush into pressed powder and swept across her cheeks, her forehead, her nose. I chose a nice, natural, peach-colored lipstick and applied it to her lips. Then I was done. I put the final touches on her face, poking and prodding here and there, and then it was over. I stepped back and gave her a final look. Honestly, I'd done a pretty great job. Her expression was perfectly peaceful. She almost looked like she was asleep. Then I left the room to grab the pair of earrings that the family left for her. As soon as I put them in, I'd be done, and I'd never have to look at this woman ever again. I grabbed them from the office, then hurried back to the morgue. I froze. Amber was smiling again. "Alan?" I shouted. "Alan?" The floor spun underneath me. I heard Alan's footsteps behind me, quickly approaching. I was losing my balance. I stumbled over to the wall and leaned against it, trying not to fall. I set her features, I told him. I stitched her mouth shut. And she's grinning again. Alan stood there frozen, his mouth hanging open, his brown skin ashen. Without a word, he walked into the room, looking over her. For several seconds he didn't say anything. "I've never seen anything like this," he said, finally. I joined him at her side. Looked down at her awful, smiling face. I noticed one of the stitches had snapped, a piece of clear thread trailed out of her mouth. It couldn't be Ben playing with us, could it? I asked. I wished it was. With all my being, I wished this was some ridiculous prank, and not the body moving on its own. Ben was the other mortician. He was considerably younger than me and Alan, only 21, and heavily influenced by social media. He was always filming something or talking about some TikTok challenge he'd done. It was nauseating. I don't think so. He's supposed to be getting the other body ready. But, we can check the security footage. Alan had installed security cameras in every room of the funeral home, after someone had broken in over the summer. I followed him down the hallway, feeling a little better with each step I put between myself and Amber. He sat down at the desk and pulled up the security footage. I held my breath as he hit play. I watched the screen as I worked on Amber's body, in the grainy black and white footage. I watched as I left to get the earrings. The door swung shut. 1 second passed. 2. And then it happened. The corners of Amber's mouth yanked up. Like they were attached to fishing line that had suddenly been pulled taut. "What the hell?" Alan said. That can't happen, can it?" I asked, my voice shaking. No. There's no way that can happen. Dead bodies move after death, on occasion. Twitching is common, caused by the release of chemicals left over in nerve endings. Decomposition can also make the body move. I'd read an article about a man whose arms had stretched straight out at his sides, weeks after death, because of decomposition. But this wasn't decomposition, because she'd been, presumably, stored properly since her death. And this wasn't a random twitch either. It was a grin. I'd read somewhere, in some inspirational article somewhere, that it took only 12 muscles to smile, and many more to frown. That meant all 12 of Amber's facial muscles were working in concert, making, and holding, a smile. It made no sense. Alan rewound the footage, playing the footage over and over again, muttering to himself about rigor mortis and other medical jargon. But I couldn't sit there and keep watching it. Each time I saw that grin yank up again, I felt like I might vomit. I left the office and hurried back to the morgue. I wanted Amber gone. And she would be, tomorrow morning, when we drove her to the cemetery. Whatever this all was, it would be gone and over with by 11 a.m. tomorrow. All I had to do was set her face again, load her into one of the refrigerated cabinets, and my job was done. When I opened the door, I found Ben standing over Amber's corpse. "Whoa," he said, as I walked in. "What did you do to this one?" "Nothing. She came like that." "Seriously? What's wrong with her?" "Nothing, to my knowledge. But she's smiling." "I know." He glanced back at me, obviously confused. "I don't know what's going on, okay? And neither does Alan. She looks like she's grinning, and when I set her face, she went back to grinning. Her face just does that, and we don't know why. She looks really creepy," he said with a grin. And then I saw his hand twitch towards his pocket, towards his phone. "Don't you even think about taking a picture," I snapped at him. I guess to Ben, the allure of making a viral TikTok video outweighed the chances of ruining his entire career. Ben left, looking dejected. Idiot. As soon as he was gone, I forced myself to re-sew her mouth shut. Then I pushed the corners of her mouth down, hard, until she looked like she was frowning. Maybe that was my problem, last time, maybe I needed to set her features in the complete opposite direction. I'm sure the family would be pissed to see her frowning at the funeral, but I didn't care. Then I slid her into the cabinet. As soon as the door shut, relief flooded me. It's over. I'm done. Little did I know, Amber was just the beginning. The next week, we got more smiling corpses. Jasmine, 47, pronounced dead at the scene of a car accident. Eleanor, 62, dead after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. John, 23, dead from a mugging gone wrong. All smiling. Alan and I called the police, the coroner, the delivery people, but no one reported seeing the bodies smiling. There were police reports too, from the car accident and the mugging, but none of those mentioned a smile. It seemed certain, all the bodies had started smiling after they died. Which didn't make a lick of sense. Alan started calling colleagues of his, even professors at the local college, but none of them knew. He started floating various theories. Maybe the coroner was using contaminated tools, or substances, that the body was having a post-mortem allergic reaction to. Maybe they were being stored at a slight incline, and that was moving the facial muscles. Of course, this didn't explain why the bodies started smiling again even after we set their features. But we were grasping at straws. No one had a possible explanation for what was going on. I pondered all this as I pulled on my rubber gloves and started work on John. I stared down at him, his pale face, his stubble-lined lips twisted into a smile. The grin somehow looked even more grotesque on his young face. I worked on autopilot. I yanked the corners of his mouth down into a deep frown. Then I grabbed the clear thread, and steadying my shaking hands, plunged the needle into his lips. I used double the number of stitches, maybe that would stop the smile from reappearing. Because despite all my work on Amber's face, her smile had reappeared. We'd gotten an irate call from her sister at the funeral. "Hey, Sam, can you come here for a second?" Ben asked, from the other side of the morgue. Sure." I followed him over. He'd been working on another smiling body, an older woman, in her 50s or 60s. I didn't remember her name, as Ben had been in charge of her. "Her file says she was 160 pounds when she died," he said. "But she feels, really light, to me." I grabbed her by the shoulders and shifted her on the table a little. Yeah, I replied. "She does feel a little light." I grabbed her by her midsection and shook her a little more. Ben was right. If I wasn't looking right at her, I would have guessed this woman was no more than 100 pounds. "Let's weigh her again," I said. Maybe the coroner entered the wrong weight. So we rolled her onto the scale. When the number came up, my heart dropped. 97 pounds. There's no way this woman is 97 pounds, I said. "I know." I stared down at her. Slightly taller than average, with an average physique. She'd have to be rail thin to be 97 pounds. If she could even get to that weight at all. Ben told me he'd discuss it with Alan, and then continued preparing her for burial. I went back to working on John. I tried to not even look at his face, just focusing on getting him ready, like it was as mundane as sweeping the floor or folding clothes. But then, as my hands worked, I had a moment of clarity. 5 smiling corpses had come in now. If it were just one, or even 2, maybe it could be explained away as an allergic reaction, or a deformity, or whatever Alan's theory of the day was. But 5? When, as far as we knew, this had never happened before. There was really only one explanation, that suddenly hit me like a ton of bricks. Something was infecting them. Maybe some sort of parasite or bacteria. Maybe in the town's water supply. I suddenly had the mental image of a pale, leech-like creature slithering around in John's mouth, stretching his lips into that hideous smile. Then something even worse occurred to me. If I touched their faces, was I now infected? Panic set in. My mouth felt itchy. Or stiff. Or something. I left John on the table and ran to the bathroom. I washed my hands, over and over again. Of course, if it were infectious, it was probably too late. But I had to do something. Of course, when I got back to the morgue, John was grinning again. The stitches had snapped and a single drop of blood coated his lips. Fuck. I stared down at him, my entire world tunneling down into a single focal point. His mouth. I had to look inside his mouth. And make sure there weren't any squiggling, writhing leeches in there. Holding my breath, I pushed my fingers into his mouth and yanked his jaw open. No. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, in the darkness of his throat. I grabbed my phone and turned the flashlight on. Hands shaking, I lifted it over his mouth and peered in. Nothing was there. I shone the flashlight all around, even lifting his lips to look at his gums and teeth, but I didn't see anything. I let out the breath I'd been holding. Get a grip. I closed his mouth. Then I forced myself to take a few deep breaths, slowly letting them out. Everything is fine. Stop scaring yourself. Calm down. I re-sewed his mouth shut, even though I knew it was probably futile. My entire body was shaking with tension, and I needed something to keep busy. As I worked, though, I noticed something else odd. Hadn't John died in a mugging gone wrong? Hadn't he been stabbed? Yet his pale skin was as perfect as porcelain. No purple bruises, no stab wounds as far as I could see. Then again, he was dressed, Ben had done that earlier, so it was very possible that all his wounds were covered by clothes. Still, I'd dealt with a few victims of muggings and other violent crimes in my career, and none of them looked as pristine as John did, even when fully dressed. Other than his deathly blue pallor, he looked as if he were in perfect health. Just sleeping. I shuddered and loaded him into the cabinet, desperate to not be looking at him anymore. A few days later, we got a visit from the sheriff. He sat with us in Alan's office, arms crossed, giving each of us an icy glare. "I'm going to have to ask you to stop investigating this," he told us plainly. "What? Why?" Alan asked. "It's attracting too much attention," he replied. "I got a call from WBX the other day, and they want to do a story on it. A skin, all kinds of questions. We don't want people, outsiders, poking around in our business, you know." "With all due respect," Alan replied, "it seems like this kind of thing has never been documented before. One of the professors at Hawthorne wants to." "No," the sheriff replied, cutting him off. "We don't want any studies conducted, nothing of the sort." "Okay. You can't make us to stop," Alan told him. "I can't," he agreed. "But let me ask you this, Alan. Do you like lawsuits? Because if there's a news story on WBX about smiling corpses, you better believe the families affected are going to be looking for someone to blame. And that someone is going to be you." A heavy silence filled the room. Alan averted his eyes. "Understood," he finally muttered quietly. "Good." And with that, the sheriff was gone. Alan cooled it on the investigation after that. I could tell it really bothered him, but the funeral home was his pride and joy. He'd bought it from the Moyner several years back, and he'd turned it from a small operation to one of the biggest funeral homes in the county. He didn't want a scandal, or lawsuits, more than anyone. So he shut up. We continued to receive more smiling corpses. We stayed quiet about it. Alan ordered some sort of industrial-strength adhesive, and when we used that on the lips instead of the thread, it seemed that the smiles didn't come back. And so for weeks, that's how we dealt with one of the most horrific things to happen in our small town. We glued corpses' mouths shut. 3 weeks had passed since the first corpse arrived. We'd received a total of 27 so far. Alan had stopped investigating, and just continued buying more and more of the adhesive by the gallon jug. But I was getting really concerned at this point. So I continued to do investigating of my own. Untraceable, anonymous stuff, so Alan wouldn't get mad at me. Internet sleuthing and the like. All my investigations into their deaths came up as dead ends, so I turned to their lives. There didn't seem to be a common thread, however. The smiling victims were every age, gender, occupation, ethnicity, religion. They seemed to have absolutely nothing in common. Until I looked up their addresses. All the victims lived within a square mile of each other. I printed out a map of the town and, in red pen, made a little dot where each of the smiling ones had lived. They formed a cluster on the west side of town, with several of them coming from the same street. The street bordering the woods of the state park. I uncapped the red pen and wrote the date above each dot. Not necessarily their death date, but the date we'd received the body, from our internal records. That's when I came to a horrifying conclusion. The first several bodies, including Amber's, had come from that street. The next bunch had come from the street surrounding it. The most recent ones, however, had come from the areas furthest from that street. In other words, it was spreading. The nexus was that street, with the smiling corpses spreading outwards towards the rest of town, like some sort of virus. What the hell? The 3 most recent ones had come from only a half-mile away from the funeral home. I explained all of this to Alan in his office, in a near whisper, with the doors closed. "It's spreading," I said, pointing to the map. "You're not supposed to be looking into this," he said angrily, although I had a feeling his anger was more about the sheriff than about me. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? But now that I know this, we have to do something." Do what, exactly? Tell the police. Like they would actually help us. He scoffed. And it doesn't seem like it's actually harming anyone. Clearly, it's not killing people, because all of them had a legitimate cause of death. Like, a lot of the smiling bodies, they're from people who died of cancer. So, what? This thing is causing cancer. I don't know. But this isn't a coincidence. Alan buried his face in his hands and let out a groan. If we tell everyone, there's gonna be a panic. And I might go out of business. So, what? We just keep it a secret? I asked. I don't know. I honestly don't. I've never come across anything like this. He let out a sigh. Just, give me some time to think about it, okay? A few days. We'll figure something out. I left his office disturbed. Alan always did the right thing, even when it meant his business suffering. I remember last year, our car had gotten into an accident while transporting a body and it had gotten a little damaged. He could have easily said the bump on her head was there when the body arrived, or tried to cover it with her hair and hoped they didn't notice, but he told them the truth. That we didn't package the body correctly, and there was an accident. We lost half of the funeral expenses, but Alan believed in doing the right thing. Or so I thought. We couldn't just keep this a secret. Something awful was happening here, and it was spreading. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I drove down to that area of town myself, to see if there was something, anything, I could figure out. I wouldn't get out of the car, in case there was something in the air. A virus, a pathogen, fungal spores. But I would drive around, and see if anything struck me. The street was within a wealthy neighborhood, a development of McMansions that had been built last year. I kept the heat off, to not let any sort of pathogen into the car, and continued driving. It was only 9 o'clock, but everything appeared closed, neon signs for gas stations and convenience stores glowing brightly in the darkness. Everything was still, silent. Then I drove up the hill and turned onto the street. I stared up at the houses. They were so sterile and harsh-looking, white with trim and gutters painted black. The wood between the window panes was painted black too, making the house look more like a prison than a home. I'm not sure whether it was the wealth of the place, or some sort of sixth sense, an instinctual feeling, but I felt unwelcome. Like I was trespassing. Like everyone in these houses was watching me, watching the beat-up sedan scutter along their pristine streets. I need to get out of here, now. I could turn around in a driveway, but I felt like that could provoke someone. My headlights would be shining right in their windows. The cul-de-sac was only about 10 yards ahead of me, anyway. When I got to the cul-de-sac, however, I froze. There were no houses here. Instead, the entire area had been cordoned off with chain-link fence. A sign hung from the metal, reading in big red letters, "Keep out." I rolled the car forward to get a better look. The site had clearly been prepared for building. Sure, the grass was long, but there weren't any trees, and the area was unnaturally flat. Within the fenced-in area, I saw 2 large, rectangular holes. The basements had been dug out already, the foundations ready to be poured. But the developer had abandoned them. Why? This development had been in high demand. I'd driven past this area of town while they were building it, and the starting price of the homes had shot up more than 50% between breaking ground and finishing the last house. So if the demand was there, and there was money to be made, why did they just stop? Maybe they found something, I thought. Maybe they dug up something. Maybe they dug up a parasite, or virus, or some other kind of pathogen. I'd read that climate change was causing ice to melt in the Arctic, and it was releasing pathogens. Wasn't there some outbreak of something in Siberia several years back? Who was to say there weren't pathogens under the ground, too? Laying in wait, dormant, until someone dug them up. I desperately wanted to get out of the car and take a closer look. But I knew that would be a really bad idea. So I inched the car forward until my tires bumped the curb. Then I flicked on the high beams. I froze. The dirt wall of the left hole looked disturbed. The soil was rough and dark, rather than smooth and crusted over. Just an animal, I told myself. Probably just a raccoon or something, that fell down there, and was scrambling to get out. Even though I told myself that, I hit the gas and sped home as fast as I could. It took me many hours of internet sleuthing to find out any information, but I finally did. A few random posts on local websites claimed the building sites had been abandoned because the soil had too much clay in it, or the rock underneath wasn't structurally sound. But there was one post on a local forum last year that I would have easily dismissed as a conspiracy theory if I hadn't been dealing with smiling dead bodies on a day-to-day basis. Did you know they found this really weird dead animal, where they're building those big houses by Johnson Park? My husband's cousin works on the construction team. He said when they were excavating, they found this dead animal. Except, it looked like nothing he'd ever seen. A really long, thin body and bluish-white skin like a cave creature or something. Like our very own Montauk monster. I stared at the computer screen, stunned. That was it. That thing must have died from whatever the pathogen was. And when it was dug up, it infected someone. Patient 0. I told Alan everything I found. Unfortunately, he seemed to take me less seriously than before, his eyebrows raising higher and higher as I told him everything. So you think the construction workers dug up this monster, and then it spread some disease to them, somehow? Yeah. Did any of the construction workers die? I frowned. She didn't say anything about it. But, like you said, the pathogen doesn't kill people. Yeah, but, wasn't this last year? We would have been getting smiling bodies for months, then, if what you're saying is true. I think they only broke ground on the last 2 houses recently. Besides, maybe it has a dormant phase, or something. Alan sighed. I mean, I suppose everything you're saying could be true. But it sounds extremely far-fetched. I know. I'll think on it. I promise. This time, his tone sounded more sincere. But right now, we've got to get back into work. A few bodies arrived today, and one of them is smiling, so good luck with that. I bought new adhesive, by the way. Extra strength. I got the message that this was the end of the conversation, loud and clear. Reluctantly, I walked out of his office and headed back to the morgue. Ben was already in there, working on someone else. He glanced up at me and grinned. Left the smiling one for you, he said. Oh, great, thanks, I replied, rolling my eyes. This day was just getting worse and worse by the minute. As I flipped through the man's files, however, I felt a rush of relief. He's supposed to be cremated, I told Ben. Oh, cool. I rolled my eyes. Ben loved the cremator. For some reason, not many people in Clearwater chose to be cremated. Whenever one did, Ben got excited. What is it with some people and fire? We rolled the body down to the cremator and got the man inside. The door clanked shut and Ben adjusted the settings, then looked at me. I gave him a thumbs up. He pulled the lever. The flames whooshed on. And then we heard it. A faint, high-pitched screech joined the pops and crackles of the fire. Almost like the shrill sound of a whistle, except more human. Ben and I looked at each other, eyes wide. What is that? I asked. Should I turn it off? Ben replied, his face white. I nodded. He yanked the lever down. But it was too late. The remains had already been reduced to lumps of charred ash. There's no chance he was actually alive, right? Ben asked. No. For the first time, he looked utterly panicked. So even though I wasn't particularly fond of Ben, I gently led him back to the morgue, and showed him the records. The man had died several days ago and been stored in a refrigerated cabinet. There was no way he could be still alive. Ben, relieved, excused himself for an early lunch break. I sat there alone in the morgue, phone in hand, swiveling gently in the chair. Something was bothering me, though I didn't want to tell Ben. First, even if the man was dead, there could still be a parasite alive inside him. Could things like leeches and tapeworms make noise? A quick search told me yes. There was a 3-centimeter marine worm that lived off the coast of Japan, for example, that could make loud popping sounds. But there was something else bothering me, too. We usually leave the bodies in the cremator for 2 to 3 hours. Because, while the soft tissue gets reduced to ash pretty fast, the bones take hours to fully carbonize. The remains we pulled out should have been a skeleton. Instead, they were just a pile of ash. How did an entire skeleton burn up so fast? I spent the rest of the day sneaking away on my phone, researching. But everything seemed to reach a dead end. I raked through the entire 10-page forum thread, where the woman had talked about the body found at the construction site. But my faith in her story started to flag. On page 3 she linked to her blog post, which was filled with both obnoxious ads and talk about aliens. She claimed they'd found metal scraps at the construction site too, burned and twisted. Our very own Roswell incident. I sighed, shaking my head. I then did a ton of searches whether certain pathogens or parasites could alter bone density. The whole thing about the skeleton not burning up seemed like the only fact I could cling to. It wasn't a gray area, it was black and white. The bones burned up when they shouldn't have. That didn't come up with much, though. Most parasites were uninterested in bones. I got out a piece of paper and wrote down everything I knew so far. The convergence of cases on that one street, the weird construction site. The smiling bodies, which had other abnormalities, not bruising, weighing less than they should, and burning up faster. After that I wrote down everyone involved. The police, the sheriff, the coroner Jack, the delivery companies, and the 3 of us, Alan, Ben, me. Several more searches only produced one interesting fact, that was probably more of a coincidence than anything else. The man who led one of the delivery companies was named Elias. The guy who worked on the construction site, mentioned in the forum posts, was also named Elias. A spark of an idea lit within me. Could Elias be patient 0? Hard at work, I see, Alan said, when he found me sitting in the morgue, staring at my phone. Oh, sorry, I said, hastily. Just taking a quick break. He didn't look happy. Ugh. Well, it was true that I'd spent a good part of the workday on my phone. Sorry, I said again. No, it's fine. Listen, we have a delivery on the way, but I got to get home. Jay's got a fever and stuff. Can you stay? I guess so. Did Ben already leave? Yeah, he cut out 10 minutes early, Alan said with a sigh. Anyway, they should be here by 6. If they're not, you can just leave. And if they're mad they have to take the body back to the coroner, that's their problem. I think the power's out in a few places, though. There was some bad thunder earlier. Yeah, well. Another sigh. Anyway, I'll lock up and everything. All you need to worry about is getting the body in. I'll pay overtime, of course, too. Sounds good. Alan left, and then it was just me, alone in the funeral home. Great. I sat by the window, waiting, watching the rain pound on the glass. The street and sidewalk glistened red, reflecting the myriad of taillights from all the braking cars. I saw a couple hurry past, angling their umbrella in front of them to try and block the rain. As the woman glanced up at our sign, she scrunched her face in disgust. We usually didn't get pedestrians here, even though we were just off Main Street. People didn't like being reminded of their own mortality. And then the delivery arrived. A sleek, dark van, rolling into the driveway. My heart pounded as I realized the text on the door read Everson Delivery Services. That was the delivery company Elias ran. I hurried downstairs. The funeral home is on a hill, and the back door is on the basement level with the morgue. Alan thought it was so convenient, but I thought it was a nuisance, going up and downstairs all the time. When I finally got to the back door, the two men were already rolling the body out of the back. "Thanks for waiting," the shorter one said, smiling at me. "Hey, can I ask you something? You work for Elias, right?" His smile instantly dropped. "We've been getting some bodies that have been, smiling," I continued, in a hushed tone. "Have you seen them?" "Nope, haven't seen anything like that," the taller man replied, shaking his head. "Do you happen to have Elias's phone number, by any chance?" The two men exchanged a glance. "Sorry, can't do that," the shorter one said. "Why not?" "He's a very private person," the taller one said, rolling the cart down the ramp. "But here you go," he said, cutting me off. Then the two men hurried back into the van. They quickly pulled out, sloshing rain everywhere, leaving me alone with the body. That was weird. Really weird. Usually the people handling the delivery always roll the body into the morgue for us. Common courtesy, in the funeral home world. But I'd spooked them with my questions about Elias. They didn't want me to know anything about him. I'm onto something. I rolled the body down the hallway myself, the metal wheels clattering against the floor. I made a sharp right into the morgue, then called Alan to let him know. Before loading the body into the cabinet, I always did a quick check. Sometimes they got a little jostled in transit, and I wouldn't want to store the body with their face tilted to the side, for example. I unzipped the body bag. No. I recognized her. Mildred. The old woman that lived 2 floors down from me. I saw her all the time. She had a little yippee dog she would walk all the time. She'd talk to me when I got my mail. She even invited me over for tea one time when I was locked out of my apartment. Mildred was dead. And she was smiling. The same smile that all of them had. Except this time, it was twisting features that were familiar to me, a face that I knew. The floor spun underneath me. I leaned against the cabinet and held myself steady, a wave of nausea rolling through me. I forced my breathing to slow. In, out. In, out. I needed to calm down. All I needed to do was zip her up, get her in the cabinet, and leave. That's all I had to do. Then I'd be on my way home, to snuggling up in a blanket and watching TV. The phone rang. I jumped about a foot in the air. Swearing, I stumbled out of the morgue and into Alan's office. Re-eyeing, the shrill sound pierced the silence. "I'm coming," I muttered under my breath, my legs wobbly beneath me. I picked it up on the 3rd ring. "Hello. Is this Moiner Funeral Home?" the voice on the other end of the line asked. "Yes." "Hi, this is Dan with Meadow Services. I'm calling to schedule the delivery of Mildred, redacted." I frowned. "What do you mean, schedule it? She was just delivered a few minutes ago." A pause. "That's not possible." A creeping dread trickled down my back. "What do you mean?" "We have her body right here," he said. "We didn't make the delivery today because of the storm." My heart plummeted to the floor. "What the fuck?" "No, there must be a mistake," I stuttered. "We just got her. She's in the morgue right now. Maybe you're getting her confused with another delivery." "No. This was the only delivery we were waiting for." My body went cold. My head spun. "Can you just tell me if tomorrow afternoon is okay, ma'am?" the voice said on the other line. "It's fine," I told him, then hung up the phone. Black dots danced in my vision. I sat down in Alan's chair before I had the chance to faint. It didn't make sense, it was her body. Unless. The realization came crashing down on me. John Ivanov, the mugging victim, with no bruises. The woman who weighed 97 pounds. The man's bones that burned up too fast in the crematory. And the smiles that kept reappearing, over and over. What if the bodies weren't the real bodies of the deceased? What if someone, somewhere along the chain, was trading out all the corpses for different ones? Clones? Replicas? Ones that were smiling, that kept smiling no matter how many times we set their features. I pulled up our records and typed in a few names of smiling bodies that I remembered. Like John Ivanov and Jasmine Thomas. My heart dropped when I saw all of them came from Everson Delivery Services. I ran out of the office, heart pounding in my ears. I ran into the morgue, and froze. Mildred's body was gone. The body bag was zipped all the way down, and it was empty. No, no, no. I ran over, hardly believing it. I unzipped the bag all the way and pressed my hands inside, as if a 180-pound woman could be hiding somewhere inside it. It was completely, totally empty. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me. Get out. Get out, now. I turned on my heel and ran down the hallway, sprinting towards the back door. I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing in the dark hallway, silhouetted by the glass door behind her, was the naked figure of Mildred. She stood perfectly still. Her dark eyes glinted. Her white hair fell in messy, scraggly curls over her face. Her skin hung loose on her body, her bare feet sticking to the linoleum floor beneath her. And she was smiling. Smiling that horrible, stretched grin. I whipped around and ran. Thunder rumbled behind me, rattling the glass. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my entire body shaking. I burst onto the first floor, ran to the front door, twisted the knob. No. Alan had locked up when he left. That included locking the front door, with the deadbolt, that only he had the key to. For a split second, I thought about going back downstairs, but then I heard it. Mildred's footsteps, coming up the stairs. What do I do? The footsteps got louder. I ran down the hallway and wrenched at one of the windows. But I was 2 stories up, the fall could kill me, especially since it wasn't grass beneath, but hard pavement. I swallowed. I have to hide. I have to. Creak. Mildred had made it to the top of the stairs. I shot out of the hallway and into the nearest room. The showroom. About a dozen caskets and coffins stood before me, of every shape and size. They glinted in the dim light, polished to perfection, alongside arrangements of fake flowers and easels displaying portraits of random people. I picked one at random, a heavy mahogany casket engraved with a cross, and climbed in. Then I pulled the heavy lid back over me, lowering it as gently as I could so it wouldn't thunk shut. As soon as I was in total darkness, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Please, I whispered, my words muffled in the soft puffy cotton sides of the casket. Please help me. I gave the woman on the other line the address. Then all I could do was wait. Thump. I heard Mildred's footsteps enter the room. Every muscle in my body froze. My breath sounded incredibly loud, like it was being piped through a surround sound stereo. So I held my breath. But even my heartbeat, the rush of blood through my veins, sounded incredibly loud locked in this casket. Thump. Please don't find me. Please. The footsteps were getting progressively louder. I couldn't see anything, it was pure darkness, like I was buried in the earth itself. I began to panic. Why am I hiding here? If she finds me, I have no escape. I should have hid in a doorway or under the stairs, so I could keep running, keep changing hiding spots. I always sucked at hide and seek. Thump. I held my breath, my entire body shaking. Thump. And then the footsteps stopped. She was right there. She seemed to have found the casket I was in. I could feel the heaviness of her presence, weighing down on the hot air of the casket itself, pressing down on me, smothering me. The casket lid opened. Mildred's face loomed over me. Her skin hung loosely over her skull. Her dark eyes twinkled. And her lips were stretched taut, into that horrible grin. Then her mouth opened. Her mouth opened wider and wider, until her jaw unhinged completely. Within her throat I could see two glittering black eyes, and the pale, bluish flesh of a creature who has never seen the sun. Just like the creature they found on Highview Lane, I thought dimly. The creature didn't infect people with a parasite. It is the parasite. For a second, I was paralyzed. Then I pulled my knees up to my chest, and kicked at her as hard as I could. Mildred staggered back. I scrambled out of the casket, the heavy lid scraping along my back, almost pinning me down. But I made my way out, fighting for my life, until I fell onto the floor. She lunged at me. My gaze caught on one of the enormous easels. I grabbed it and pointed one leg of it at her mouth. "Don't get any closer," I shouted. Of course, the creature in there didn't understand. As soon as Mildred took a jerky, stumbling step forward, I thrust the leg into her open mouth. An inhuman screech filled the room. I dropped the easel and ran down the stairs. I made it to the back door and burst through it, out into the storm. A torrent of rain fell onto me, soaking me. Thunder rumbled in the distance, cut with the sound of distant sirens. I stumbled towards the road, glancing back a final time. Mildred wasn't following. When the police broke into the building, they found Mildred's eviscerated body. It appeared to have just been a shell, completely hollowed out on the inside. As for the creature that was living inside of her, there was no sign of it. Or so they said. Sometimes I wonder if they actually captured it, and took it off to some secret government compound for examination. Everson Delivery Services promptly went out of business. Elias skipped town and disappeared off the map completely. I wonder if he's really Elias at all, or if he's simply a meat suit, a shell, controlled by one of the alien creatures. Because a few weeks later, while I was in the checkout line, I saw the headline on a tabloid newspaper. "Wife comes back from the dead." I flipped open the magazine and skimmed the article. It claimed the woman had been dead for over 24 hours, and spent the night in a funeral home. I stared at the photo of the woman, glossy on the page. She had her hands together, like she was clapping, and her mouth was open in a shout of joy. Maybe it was just the low-quality ink, the crappy paper tabloids use, but I thought I could see a strange glint at the back of her mouth. Maybe. Or maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe real human bodies are too full of bones and organs and blood to inhabit, so they build a replica, based on the corpses of those who have died. Maybe their plan was always to animate those shells and come back into their grieving families' lives. Or maybe all of this was just practice, and maybe there are now shells walking around all over the place. Maybe they don't wait for the victims to die on their own anymore. Maybe these creatures lay in wait in alleyways and dark corners, ready to pick us off one by one and steal our lives. Whatever their plan, they were clever. The police never found where all the real dead bodies went. And the other 30 smiling corpses were sent to a lab for examination. The ones that had already been buried were exhumed. Sheriff Thompson told us it was a parasite, something in the water, highly contagious. Areas of Clearwater were cordoned off for decontamination. Highview Lane was evacuated. But I know the truth. Because Alan and I kept one of the smiling corpses. The family had asked that he be cremated, and we gave them fake ashes instead. I know, that's a horrible thing to do, except it isn't that horrible, when you consider the remains weren't even his to begin with. Alan and I set the body on the table in front of us, staring at each other. "You ready?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I am," I replied. Alan sunk a scalpel into the dead man's chest. He peeled back the skin, and when I leaned forward, I almost threw up. The man had no ribs, no organs, nothing that was remarkably human. In their place was a creature with pale bluish skin, folded in on itself. Hands shaking, I leaned over the man's face, and pulled his mouth open. Beyond his teeth, in the darkness of his throat, I could see a pale face. Eyes closed, as if it were sleeping. Alan and I gave each other a look. Then we rolled the body off to the cremator.